Guadalcanal, 2 o'clock in the morning, the 26th of October, 1942. On a dark ridge above a vital airfield, a single United States Marine sergeant crouched behind a machine gun, and all around him in the blackness, his men lay dead or wounded. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were charging up the slope toward him, screaming in the night, determined to break through and seize the airfield beyond. The sergeant did not run. Instead, he scrambled from one gun to the next along his shattered line, firing each in turn, a one-man wall of fire holding back an entire enemy regiment. His name was Mitchell Paige. Mitchell Paige was the son of poor immigrants, a young man who had hitchhiked hundreds of miles just to join the Marine Corps. On that ridge, with his 33 men killed or wounded around him, he would do something so extraordinary that it has been studied ever since as one of the greatest individual stands in the history of the Corps. He would hold the line alone through the night, and at first light, he would cradle a red-hot machine gun in his bare arms and lead a bayonet charge straight down the hill into the enemy. This is the story of how he and his men helped save Guadalcanal. To understand that night, you have to understand the island. In the autumn of 1942, Guadalcanal was the most important piece of ground on Earth to the men fighting for it. On this steaming, jungle-choked island in the South Pacific sat an airfield the Americans had seized and named Henderson Field, and whoever controlled that airfield controlled the skies over the Southern Pacific and the sea lanes to Australia. The Japanese were throwing everything they had into retaking it. For weeks, by land, sea, and air, the battle had raged, and now it was reaching its bloody climax on the ridges above the field. By late October, the Japanese had landed a powerful force and were preparing one last great assault to smash through the Marine lines and capture Henderson Field. If they broke through, Guadalcanal might be lost, and with it, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. Standing in their path, on a thinly held ridge, were a few hundred exhausted Marines, among them Sergeant Mitchell Paige and his small machine gun section. What happened on that ridge, in the darkness, would help decide the fate of the entire campaign. To see how it came to that, we go back to the beginning of the ordeal. Before we go on, if you appreciate these forgotten stories of the men who were there, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end, because the full weight of what Mitchell Paige did that night only lands once you understand the desperate battle swirling around him. And that battle began months earlier, in August of 1942, when United States Marines waded ashore on a far-off island most Americans had never heard of to launch their nation's first great counterstroke against Japan. On August 7th, 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands. It was the first major American ground offensive of the entire war, the moment the United States stopped retreating and began to hit back. The Marines quickly seized the half-built airfield the Japanese had been constructing and made it their own, naming it Henderson Field. But taking the airfield was one thing. Holding it on an island swarming with a determined enemy and cut off by sea would prove to be a nightmare that tested the Marines beyond anything they had imagined. For months, the Marines on Guadalcanal lived a brutal existence, pounded by enemy warships at night, bombed by day, racked by malaria, and short of food and supplies. Among them was Mitchell Paige, a platoon sergeant in the 7th Marine Regiment. Born in Pennsylvania to Serbian immigrant parents, Paige had grown up idolizing the veterans who marched in his town's parades, and at 18, he had traveled hundreds of miles to enlist in the Marine Corps. He had already served in the Philippines and in China before the war. Now, on Guadalcanal, all of that hard training was about to be put to the ultimate test. By October 1942, the Japanese were determined to settle the matter once and for all. They funneled thousands of fresh troops onto the island under cover of darkness, amassing for an all-out offensive to overrun the Marine perimeter and seize Henderson Field. Their plan called for a powerful assault through the jungle to strike the American lines from several directions at once. The Marines, stretched thin around their perimeter, knew a great blow was coming, but the jungle was so dense that no one could be certain exactly where or when it would fall. Sergeant Paige and his men dug in on a ridge and waited. Paige's machine gun section, just 33 men, held a position on a hill near the Matanacao River, guarding one approach to the airfield. They set up their handful of water-cooled machine guns along the crest, dug in, and strung out their thin line in the dark. Below them, the jungle dropped away into shadow, silent and black. The men knew the enemy was out there somewhere in the trees, in unknown numbers, and that when the attack came, it would likely come at night. Through the evening of October 25, they watched and listened, nerves stretched taut, straining to catch any sound from the blackness below. As the night deepened, the tension on the ridge became almost unbearable. Then, in the small hours of the morning, Mitchell Paige heard it. Voices low and guttural, drifting up from the jungle, perhaps 100 yards away, along with the soft clinking of equipment. The enemy was assembling in the darkness just below them, gathering for the assault. Paige moved quietly along his line, waking his men, making sure every gun was loaded and ready, whispering for them to hold their fire until the last possible moment. Each man gripped his weapon and stared into the black wall of jungle, waiting for the storm to break. It broke with terrifying force. Japanese artillery and mortars came crashing down on the ridge, the explosions ripping through the night and showering the Marines with dirt and steel. And then, out of the darkness, came the infantry. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged up the slope in a screaming wave, charging straight at Paige's thin line of guns. The Marines opened fire, their machine guns hammering into the oncoming mass, muzzle flashes strobing the darkness. Men fell, but more kept coming, wave after wave, clambering forward to reach the crest, until the fighting was almost on top of the guns. The weight of the assault was overwhelming. There were simply too many of them. The Japanese poured against the ridge, in numbers later estimated in the thousands, a force perhaps the size of an entire regiment, smashing into a section of just 33 Marines. In the savage, close-range fighting, Paige's men were cut down one after another, killed or wounded at their guns. The line began to come apart. On the slope below, the enemy pressed closer, sensing that the position was about to break. And then Mitchell Paige looked around in the chaos and realized a terrible truth. He was the only man on his guns still standing. In that moment, Mitchell Paige faced a choice that would define everything. The men to his left and right were down. The enemy was almost upon him. He could have fallen back into the darkness, and no one would have blamed him. But behind that ridge lay Henderson Field, and Paige knew that if his position fell, the door to the airfield would be thrown wide open, so he made his decision. He would not leave. Alone, with the enemy swarming up the hill toward him, he threw himself behind the nearest machine gun, and he began to fire. What followed was almost beyond belief. As one gun ran dry or was knocked out, Paige scrambled through the dark and the gunfire to the next, and the next, racing up and down his shattered line so that the enemy could never tell how few defenders remained. He fired burst after burst into the charging ranks, the barrels glowing hot, holding back the assault by the sheer fury of his lone resistance. The Japanese, certain the ridge was still strongly held, kept hurling themselves against it. For hour after desperate hour, in the darkness, one Marine held the line that stood between the enemy and the airfield. The fighting was savage and intimate, often at arm's length. At one point, a Japanese soldier lunged out of the dark and drove a bayonet at Paige's head. The sergeant threw up his hand to block the blade, and it sliced deep into his fingers. Wounded and bleeding, Paige struck back instantly, killing his attacker at close quarters, and then turned back to his guns. There was no time to think about the pain or the danger. There was only the next wave, the next gun, the next belt of ammunition, and the desperate need to keep the storm of fire pouring down the slope. To make matters even more dangerous, The Marine Rifle Company's position behind Paige had been forced to pull back a short distance under the pressure, leaving his guns dangerously exposed and all but surrounded. He was now fighting in a pocket almost entirely on his own, with the enemy pressing in from more than one side. Still, he would not give up the ridge. He shifted position constantly, firing from one spot and then another, doing the work of a dozen men. His whole world narrowed to the muzzle flashes in front of him and the line he had sworn to hold. Between bursts of fire, Paige got word back that he needed reinforcements, and badly. But help could not come quickly through the chaos and the dark, and so he simply held on, alone, minute by agonizing minute. Time lost all meaning. There was only the rhythm of the guns, the endless waves of attackers, and the iron refusal to let the line break. Again and again the Japanese came, and again the lone sergeant met them with a wall of fire. By holding that ridge through the worst of the night, Mitchell Paige was buying the time the Marines around him desperately needed. What Paige could not have fully known in the darkness was just how much was riding on his stubborn stand. His ridge was one of the key points the Japanese had to seize to crack the Marine perimeter and reach Henderson Field. Every hour he held, every charge he threw back, drained the strength from the enemy assault and gave the rest of the Marines time to plug the gaps and bring up help. The fate of the whole sector, and perhaps the campaign, was turning on the actions of a handful of men on a few hundred yards of ridge, and on one sergeant who simply would not quit. Slowly, after hours of relentless combat, the tide of the assault began to ebb. The Japanese attacks had cost them dearly, and the first faint gray of dawn was creeping into the sky over the jungle. Mitchell Paige was still there, still on his guns, wounded, exhausted, and blackened with smoke, but unbroken. And now, at last, he could hear movement behind him that was not the enemy. Marine reinforcements were finally coming up to the ridge, but Paige was not finished yet. As the light grew, he looked down the slope at the enemy, and a fierce idea took hold of him. As the reinforcing Marines reached him, Mitchell Paige did not simply sink to the ground in relief. He had held the ridge all night on the defensive, and now, with daylight coming and fresh men beside him, he meant to drive the enemy off it for good. Quickly, he gathered the riflemen around him and formed them into a new line at the crest. The Japanese on the slope below were battered and disorganized after their long night of failed assaults. Paige sensed that one bold stroke might be enough to break them completely and end the threat to his sector once and for all. What he did next became the stuff of Marine Corps legend. Paige unclamped one of the water-cooled machine guns from its mount, a heavy weapon meant to be fired from a tripod, and he picked it up and cradled the scorching hot barrel in his bare arms. He slung belts of ammunition over his shoulders. Then he turned to the riflemen behind him and gave the order, "Fix bayonets and follow me." And with that, the wounded sergeant rose to his feet and charged down the ridge straight at the enemy, firing the heavy gun from his hip as he ran, his Marines surging behind him. The sight of a Marine storming down the hill, firing a machine gun from his arms with a line of bayonet-wielding men at his heels, was too much for the exhausted Japanese. Caught in the open and unsure how many Americans were coming at them, they broke. The last of the attackers fell back down the slope and melted into the jungle, their great assault shattered. As the sun rose over Guadalcanal, the ridge was firmly in American hands, and Mitchell Paige, his arms burned, his hand cut, his body utterly spent, was still standing on the ground he had refused to surrender. The cost had been heavy. Of the 33 men in Paige's section, every single one had been killed or wounded in the night's fighting. Their stand, and his, had held one of the doors to Henderson Field, and the great Japanese offensive of October had failed. It proved to be the enemy's last major attempt to take the airfield by storm. A general would later tell Paige that the hill he and his men held had been one of the most important on the whole island. When Paige was awarded the Medal of Honor for that night, he insisted the honor was not his alone. It belonged, he said, to all 33 men of his platoon. Mitchell Paige was given a battlefield promotion to lieutenant, and in the spring of 1943, in Australia, he received the Medal of Honor from the commander of the 1st Marine Division. Standing near him that day was another young Marine being honored for the same desperate Guadalcanal fighting, Sergeant John Basilone, whose name would also become legend. Paige went on to serve through the rest of the war and remained in the Marine Corps for years afterward, rising eventually to the rank of colonel before he finally retired from the Corps he had loved since he was a boy. In his later years, Mitchell Paige found a new mission. Angered by men who falsely claimed to have won the Medal of Honor, he devoted himself to exposing these impostors, and his efforts helped lead to laws protecting the honor of the medal and those who had truly earned it. He wrote a memoir of his life, and he lived long enough to become the very last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. When he died in 2003, a quiet chill settled over the cemetery as Marines carried him to his rest, one of the great heroes of the Pacific War, honored at the last. Mitchell Paige told his own story in his memoir, A Marine Named Mitch. But the heart of it is what he himself always insisted, that he did not hold that ridge alone. He held it on the courage of 33 men who fell beside him and for the thousands of Marines whose lives depended on that line. His stand leaves a question worth remembering. Is the hero the one man left standing, or all the men who made his stand possible? Paige knew his answer and gave it every time he spoke of that night. If you had family who served on Guadalcanal or who wore the Marine uniform, share their name below and tell us one thing about them. They were not forgotten then. They will not be forgotten now. Remember them by name. Subscribe if you would like the next story.